my story that are really typical, and then there are aspects of my story that are atypical.
Come out and represent such a positive, healthy role model of recovery.
We have what we call the Alliance in Billings, which is the 3 major healthcare providers.
The day when he's really alert and can focus on his work. And then somebody this morning talked
into getting the world a better place. And it's both true, because the professionals actually need the resources, the payments.
Some of the policies that we are driving are targeting those kinds of issues, but it's not like it's
analogy as opposed to an electrical line analogy, the circuitry and learning.
My name is Louise Livingood, and I serve on the board of NAMI, Montana. And I would like to introduce our next guest speaker, Dr. Eric Truppen. Dr. Truppen is a child psychologist, an educator, and has served both at a state and federal level, helping to improve our mental health services. I would like you to all join me in a warm Montana welcome for Dr. Eric Truppen.
Thank you very much. Actually, I haven't been paying close enough attention. I can just turn on this mic and walk around. I'm going to talk about a subject and change I think the tone a little bit from Dr. Duckworth, whose fabulous presentation about issues related to post-traumatic stress disorder and kind of just such a wonderful sense of his commitment and his passion about the work that he does and his engagement with families and commitment to change. And I want to talk more about the failures of our system, and many of you families will know exactly what I'm talking about. Because the failure of our system as it relates to the children and the adolescents who, for a whole host of reasons, do not benefit from the effectiveness of our health system or our mental health system. And I always think about it in terms of as a mental health provider and a researcher and an advocate and a policymaker. For children and adolescents with mental illness or serious emotional disturbances or chemical dependencies and substance abuse problems who don't have successful interventions, the pathway, the route, the non-royal road is from poor outcome in school, getting in trouble with the law. The pathway is into the juvenile justice and adult correction system. I suspect you all know that the outcomes for our kids who get in trouble, who have serious emotional disorders, are ones in which are often addressed not by the mental health system, but often are addressed or not addressed by the juvenile justice and adult system. So that's what I'm going to talk about. I've devoted a goodly amount of my late career to trying to address that issue, because it is one of the shames of our society that we treat our children, particularly those children with mental illness and serious emotional disorders, with a correctional approach rather than a rehabilitative approach. So I'm going to take you through what I consider the scope of the problem, give you some data. I'm going to show you some videos of a couple of settings where I've worked and where the outcomes are, even though they look pretty sad, the outcomes are pretty good because we are making progress in this area. However, the progress is slow. So let me kind of take you through this. I think if there's a question anywhere along the way, please just stop me and ask me about it. So first I'm going to talk about prevalence issues. Prevalence of kids with serious emotional disorders, co-occurring disorders, mental illness. What are the incidents, and particularly as it relates to the juvenile justice system? Talk about the growing sense of the crisis, which I think for anybody who has a family member who's involved with juvenile justice or adult corrections, it's a constant crisis and sense of urgency. I'm going to talk about the responses and talk a little bit about what I think are some next steps. Just for the purposes of making sure you have a little bit of, just a little bit more background. I'm a professor at the University of Washington in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences, and run a program called Public Behavioral Health and Justice Policy. And the intent of that program being that we train a lot of your health professionals, so I feel a sense of commitment here, because WWAMI is Washington, well, now it's Washington, Wyoming, Alaska, Montana, and Idaho, and we, in fact, hold places for students in a variety of our professional schools who come to the University of Washington and get trained. The goal of my program is to train psychiatrists, psychologists, nurses, and social workers to effectively, skillfully choose careers in the public sector. Essentially to work with people with the most serious behavioral health disorders. Not just train them to be effective clinicians and practitioners, but be effective systems change people. So that's one of the things. And we do research. We're very much involved in looking at improving outcomes for people. And then because we're, in many ways, very fortunate, some of my colleagues don't think it's so fortunate, but we're pretty fortunate in being the only health sciences, or major health sciences medical school in this region. We do a great deal of policy work with the legislators and legislatures. I myself have spent quite a bit of time in Washington, D.C. I spent a year working in Congress, attempting to craft mental health legislation that would be more responsive to the needs of the citizens of this country, and kind of almost did it. We missed a number of times. I'm optimistic maybe we'll get it right in the next 4 or 8 years. So the other work that I do is I'm the expert for the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. They have to remember that our U.S. Department of Justice still has a Civil Rights Division, and they, in fact, investigate conditions of confinement in state hospitals and jails and prison, and the intent is to make sure that those facilities are applying what the founders of our country thought were important in terms of constitutional rights to people. So I'm the mental health expert on a number of settlements and consent decrees in California and Maryland and Louisiana and Mississippi and a number of other states, which is actually something I'll talk a little bit about. So enough of that kind of context. So any given day in this country, it's probably more like 125, 130,000 kids in juvenile justice facilities. Over the past 2 decades, the number have doubled, actually tripled, and over the past 2 decades, they've stabilized somewhat now. But we, in fact, incarcerate a larger number of children and adults than pretty much anywhere in the Western world. We're #1 in that. And as is the case, because minority status often goes along with being poor, a disproportionate number of minority children are incarcerated or detained. This is a low estimate. Over 50% of the youth who are detained commit a new crime within 6 to 12 months of the detention. Many places have 70, 80% recidivism. So, you know, it's extraordinary if we were doing this as a business and we're looking at the outcomes, we would be shamed by those outcomes. To have that, when the intent is to rehabilitate and reduce criminal behavior, that in fact we only by chance, and when we're lucky, have an impact on that. The costs are extraordinary. I don't know Montana numbers, so I can't speak for Montana, but in New York State, it's $95,000 a year. In Louisiana, probably in terms of wages, probably the lower wage state, it's $55,000. Washington State, it's $74,000. California, it's $160,000. In California, where you have 70% recidivism rates, bad outcome. Think about what you could do with $160,000. How many more PAC teams you can have, how many more systematic, assertive community interventions we could have with $160,000. So there's an enormous amount of money spent on this enterprise. And as you can see, there are 6 states in this country that spend more on prison and detention facilities than on colleges and universities. Pretty sad, huh? I mean, if we were getting great outcomes, you know, if these kids never committed another crime and they were rehabilitated and there was a really effective treatment and they came back to families and wanted to go and be productive citizens, that would be one thing. Well, you know, who would care how much money? But that's not the case. Yeah?
Is that
per person? Per person, okay? So if you have, like in California, up until fairly recently, there were 12,000 juveniles housed. Go 12,000 times 160,000. Just general population numbers, just I want to make the contrast between what goes on in the general population, what goes on in juvenile justice, that 20% of the kids, at one point of the other, experience a diagnosable mental health disorder. 10% of kids will suffer it enough that it's going to impact them. Many of us here are functioning with one disorder or another, but we're kind of functioning okay. But 10% of that, 20 of those kids, really gets in their way, and less than half of those kids receive any treatment. So in the juvenile justice population, the rates are 2 or 3 times higher, and most of the kids in that have a diagnosable disorder. 70%. I've done a number of studies, and if anyone wants this research, I'll give you my email, and we've done quite a few prevalence studies looking at this issue, systematic prevalence studies where we've actually gone in and done diagnostic interviews with kids and been able to really sample this population effectively. So 1 out of 5 has a serious mental disorder, and over half of these has a co-occurring substance disorder. And again, I'm preaching to the choir here. I mean, I think you all recognize, and particularly as it relates to adolescents, that adolescents tend to be risk takers and dysregulated if in fact they have a mental illness or a serious emotional disorder. The effect of substances never helps, it exacerbates. So most of these kids that we see have both a mental health disorder or a psychiatric diagnosis, which includes a substance use disorder. So, as I said, 65 to 75% have a mental disorder. 74 more girls than boys, because in order to get detained for a young woman or a girl, usually their problem has to be, because the system is designed to be more sympathetic around, and judges are more sympathetic around diversion for girls. So you see the girls in our juvenile justice system. I don't know if there are any juvenile justice people here in the audience, but you'll often see girls detained who have more serious emotional problems. As again, I said, the co-occurrence is significant. It's shocking, but so that, and again, I would not be surprised if some of you parents in this audience, or maybe some of you yourselves, have found that youth are being detained in order to access services, or they're maintained in detention for longer periods of time because services are not available. This was a congressional study done a couple of years ago by Congressman Waxman and Senator Collins from Maine. And kids will be detained or held in detention. So talk about a violation of one's rights because you can't find treatment for them, or this is the only place where treatment is available. This happened in Montana? Yeah. So the earlier you get kids involved in the justice system, the more likely they're going to stay in the justice system, is my first slide, my first bullet there. And effective treatment approaches, there are a whole host. Now this is the tragedy of this. When I started in this field 25, 30 years ago, I think I knocked 5 years off when I started in this field, every talk I give. But a long time ago, when I started, I mean, we were flying by the seat of our pants, be it related to psychosocial interventions. What did we know about engagement and enhancing skill set of parents? I mean, as Dr. Duckworth was talking about, we spent our time blaming parents, and why would we want to sort of work with people in that way? And we knew very little about effective treatment interventions. We knew diddly squat about what psychopharmacology could bring to bear. So we know a tremendous amount now in terms of what's effective and what's an evidence-based practice. Unfortunately, it's rarely used. I mean, when you look at what actually goes on in our public mental health and juvenile justice world, you rarely see an active implementation of an evidence-based practice. So, despite the fact we know that we can improve positive outcomes, and I'll talk more about what is it that's getting in our way? How is it we can't convince our policymakers and legislators that there is a way to do this that is more strategic, more humane, and in fact saves money? We're challenged about this in this country. Media all over the place about this. I think again, not knowing Montana, but there's an article somewhere in the United States about some outrage in the juvenile justice system, or some misspent dollars, or some abuse going on. If you talk about the world of traumatization of youth in a correctional and juvenile justice system, the rules of restraint and seclusion that we are all trying to move into the way one manages an individual who is experiencing a crisis is not routinely followed, to say the least. People use cuffs, and I'll show you an example of this in media. So aggressively moving into these settings and shedding light and becoming more actively involved is really critical in changing the practices, because what often happens with adolescents as well as adults is they get themselves in situations where they're dealt with in a correctional way rather than a rehabilitative way. If the correctional way worked, good deal, but it doesn't. Yeah?
Are the juvenile facilities in some of these states privately run, or are they state-run, like in the adult
Yes, some of them are, in fact, been privatized. It's been a strategy around the country to, for a variety of reasons. The notion was somehow public servants don't do things very well, and the private sector is much more effective. And that may be so in some areas. It's not been proved to be very, very much the case. There's not a lot of profit to be made on when in fact you're required to provide a variety of services. So what we found is around the country that there are many, many violations of people's rights. So the privatization has been a real failure. And again, I don't know what goes on in Montana. That the public sector lose interest in monitoring, and all sorts of unfortunate things occur. Saving of money, not so good outcome. And the savings of money goes away because then there's all sorts of litigation and liability. Yeah. Okay. Let me just briefly talk about disparities, because it's again it's a pretty big issue, and I think it's partly kind of the struggle we have in this country with race and ethnicity. Thank you. And partly the reality. So I just want to make sure you recognize that 2/3 of the juveniles in detention in state correctional facilities are youth of color. So I would assume in Montana, where there's a larger percentage of Native American people, that there's a higher incidence of Native American youth who are being detained. I don't know the data from Montana, but I know it in other settings. The disparities exist in all different levels. So if you get involved with the juvenile justice system, you're less likely, if you're a minority person, to get a diversion or to get some sort of community activity. So and again, this is what the data shows. So in terms of decision making around the country, if you happen to be brown or black or whatever, you're more likely to be placed outside, or the consequences of what you've done end up in being more likely to be removed from your family and placed outside of your home, rather than let's come up with a strategy that keeps you at home and let's provide the resources to your family to try to get you to the treatment that you need. And then again, around the country, African American, Latino youth receive more punitive treatment than whites. It's the way it is. I mean, I think we all have hypotheses about it, but it tends to be. Many more pieces of data about the issue of disproportionality and disparities. I was very interested in Washington State in all the children who were being cared for under the aegis. We have an umbrella department that does child welfare, mental health, substance abuse, and what I wanted to look at was in each of the different divisions of the state that take care of kids. So the child welfare, the juvenile justice, the developmental disability settings, mental health, and I also wanted to look at regular education and special education. What I did was we came up with a formula for the children who are in our state hospital. We'll look at all of the factors and characteristics of the kids who were being served in our state hospital. And what I wanted to do is see in these different systems whether there were similarities or dissimilarities. So essentially what I found, again, the index population are kids in the state hospital, the most seriously mentally ill, seriously emotionally disturbed kids in our state. So we could not, 67% of the kids in the child welfare system, we couldn't differentiate them from the kids in the state hospital. So the overlap was extraordinary. 76% of the kids in the juvenile justice system. So using standardized measures, mental health measures, what we found, and again, you'll find it here, we find it everywhere across the country, that these systems manage youth that have serious emotional disorders, and often they don't manage them, nor do they provide the kind of intervention that these kids need. Just because of the nature of, we wanted to look at this population of serious emotional disturbed kids, what you find, again, no surprise to you family members, are that many of these kids have been early involvement with the child welfare system and often being removed from home early on. So you can kind of see that what the strategy is, well, let's come up with a plan by which we place these children outside the home in a residential treatment center, in a hospital, in a foster care setting, rather than, and we look at these bad outcomes, rather than let's think about a strategy, a resource that would support families in terms of, no matter what the acuity is, let's see what we can come up with that will be helpful. That doesn't mean that out-of-home placements aren't necessary at some time. And that doesn't mean that sometimes youth don't need acute hospitalization, but that the focus of our intervention should be on maintaining families and maintaining youth in that context. So, around the country, viewed as a growing crisis, juvenile justice looked at as a last resort. NAMI did a survey a number of years ago, and 36% of youth placed in juvenile justice systems, as I talked about before, were there in order to get access to services. The whole host of studies documenting the failure, and the Department of Justice, God bless them, our founding fathers who sort of thought about the Constitution and that we ought to have our rights protected in many ways. But the 8th and 14th Amendments of our Constitution are very important as it relates to the rights of people with mental illness, and particularly those who are involved in the juvenile justice system or the correctional system. Due process and cruel and unusual punishment. Those are two things that need to be protected. So let me just go to where I want to go. I'll come back here. In 1980, Congress enacted something called Civil Rights of Institutional Persons. And essentially what it does is it requires the Department of Justice to monitor and investigate what are perceived as violation of civil rights for people who are in fact incarcerated, detained, placed in state mental hospitals, placed in private hospitals under the aegis of a court order. And it's actually been the most effective way that we've found to bring about change. And the reason that it's become such a focus is the profound violation of civil rights, particularly of youth, in these juvenile justice settings. So I'm going to just stop here, and I'm going to show you a relatively short video of what happened in South Dakota. It's a pretty poignant video, but it'll give you a good sense of the context and the aggressiveness, why we are so aggressive in looking at system change. I probably don't need to tell you people why we're so aggressive.
Response to reports of abusive conditions for incarcerated children at the South Dakota State Training School in Plainton, South Dakota, the Youth Law Center and local attorneys conducted an investigation of the facility. They found that staff placed youth in 4-point restraints while spread-eagled on cement slabs and locked youth in isolation cells for as many as 23 hours a day for weeks and sometimes months at a time. Staff used excessive force through cell extraction teams trained at the state's adult penitentiary and censored for negative comments the mail that children sent to their families. In addition to physical abuses of confined children, The center's attorneys found serious inadequacies in mental health services, special education services for disabled youth, and training for staff. In February 2000, the center and the local lawyers filed a civil rights class action lawsuit against the state. This videotape footage was shot by corrections staff at the facility. It was obtained by the Youth Law Center through the litigation. The majority of youth confined at the state training school are there for nonviolent crimes. Many are held for status offenses such as truancy, curfew violations, running away from home, and underage consumption of alcohol. As is the case throughout the country, these youths are disproportionately poor and children of color. As many as 40 to 45% of the young people in the Plainview facility are Native American, although Native youth make up only about 10% of the adolescent population of the state. In addition, a substantial number of the children at Plainview suffer from mental disorders, and many of them end up in the facility due to a lack of appropriate community-based services or other services needed to address their emotional and behavioral problems. Many of these children engage in self-harming behavior. At Plainview, however, the response of staff was to put them in 4-point restraints. Along with their underlying emotional disorders, many have other problems that have not been addressed. These include physical and/or sexual abuse, drug or alcohol use, family discord, poor school performance, and learning disabilities. Studies show that nationwide, as many as 60% of incarcerated youth have mental health problems, with as many as 20% suffering from severe disorders. Half to 3/4 have co-occurring alcohol or substance abuse problems. In many instances, staff react to minor adolescent misbehavior by using force. This youngster placed paper on the windows of his cell, and the staff responded by spraying him with pepper spray, a form of tear gas embedded with cayenne pepper.
I've been over here, this is 4 times, 5 times today.
Who said that bullshit?
I did. I can't have you doing what you're doing.
The pepper spray is intended to immobilize the person sprayed. It is quite painful. This boy was in considerable pain for more than 20 minutes. Although he agreed to comply with staff directives after being sprayed, the staff summoned a cell entry team, which is similar to teams used in riots at the state penitentiary.
Leading up to this, has been doing things to push things all morning. Tried talking to him, and he still keeps doing them. Plan of action will be to get cuff up, not the new OC, and then I'll go ahead and team work on it.
The cell entry team was unnecessary, since the boy complied with staff requests and put his hands through the slot in the cell door to be handcuffed. After the boy was in handcuffs, and despite the fact that he was calm, staff put him in 4-point restraints. While they did this, they covered him with a plastic shield, which escalated the situation. In well-run juvenile facilities, staff are trained in effective de-escalation techniques and alternative interventions, and are able to avoid these types of confrontation situations.
It's now 4:37, we just finished 4 points. Got a little problems, the cops were a little bit too short, so we did some changing. No injuries for the team.
There were many examples of excessive and unnecessary force, evidence of the adult corrections approach at the facility. Some youth became so institutionalized that they saw the use of restraints as a normal part of the give and take with staff. As an example, this boy was joking with staff as they placed him in restraints. Cell entry teams were used frequently, even after staff used chemical agents such as pepper spray.
I have told the cuff up, I have asked him, and I have ordered him. I have sprayed him with pepper spray. At this time, we will take the team in. I will order him to cuff up. If he doesn't, I will open the door and I will send the team in. Cuff up right now.
Here, the officer sprays the boy.
Cuff up. Cuff up. Cuff up.
Also, correctional staff engaged in the humiliating and degrading practice of attaching a leash to handcuff the youth as they moved them around the facility. It is extremely dangerous to cover a youth's face with a towel, particularly when they are being restrained. This restraint board is another example of improper and unnecessary use of restraints. It seems clear here that the restraint is being used as punishment rather than as a last resort to control dangerous behavior. Note that this young boy is not out of control and is calm throughout the restraint procedure. Staff thought the boy would be receptive to learning a lesson.
Why can't you work half as much on helping yourself as much as you are hurting yourself? Live easier in the store? You don't like it when somebody cares. I wouldn't let you do your work, but you want to make conditions, and you don't make conditions. I'm in control here, not you.
Girls were subject to some of the worst abuses. These young girls, typical of girls in the juvenile justice system, often had complex health and mental health issues related to past histories of sexual and emotional abuse, substance abuse, trauma, and violence. The excessive use of home isolation and restraints, poorly trained staff, lack of adequate mental health services, and the loss of privacy all added to the negative feelings and loss of control felt by the girls, resulting in extensive self-mutilation and suicide attempts. Was so deeply ingrained in the facility that staff treated youth as dangerous prisoners, even when they were giving them meals. At Plankington, youth were often kept in restraints for 1-hour periods, although all standards and the facility's own policy require that youth be released from restraints as soon as they are under control. A number of young people, such as this girl, were held for successive 1-hour periods.
It is now 6:05. Her 4-quarter check was completed. She was compliant during the whole entire time. She was fed. She was also compliant. The technical issue, you could see her within exactly 1/2 hour that the technical determination was taken off for.
Staff interaction often escalated relatively calm situations. These 3 girls were already handcuffed together as a result of earlier misbehavior. Here, lack of staff training and an institutional culture where force is the primary means of control created a dangerous and abusive incident in which the staff pushed and pulled in girls who were handcuffed at the wrists. Throughout the investigation and subsequent litigation, local advocates, parents of confined youth who form the Parents Who Care Coalition, and national advocacy organizations such as the Youth Law Center and the Center on Juvenile and Criminal Justice used media advocacy to draw attention to the abusive and dangerous conditions in the facility. The result was extensive local coverage of the issues and attention from national news organizations. For example, the following excerpt from a 60 Minutes 2 story covering the events surrounding the case in South Dakota aired on CBS on January 2nd, 2001.
The juvenile prison at Plankington is now under a federal court supervision. Based on what happened to Dean, Hannah, Michael, and others, South Dakota has agreed to radically change the way juveniles are treated. In a negotiated settlement to a federal lawsuit, there will be no more four-pointing using metal restraints, no more isolation for weeks at a time, and the state has agreed to greatly expand its mental health care.
It was the United States. It was a state just east of here. It wasn't some other country. When I look at it, and I still sort of look at it, and I go around the country, and I see places still not that different. From that, the theme here just is this profound way in which we look at these youth. Not that they don't have problems, not that they're not tough, but that we've treated them in a way that you would treat or a way you would manage a 45-year-old hardened criminal rather than a 13-year-old who has a whole host of behaviors that need to be worked with and managed. In this particular facility, the notion of parent participation or visits was just, Sunday for 2 hours, one phone call a month. So, if you think about the basis of our society and the core of our society is the family. And if we want to move in a direction that is much more like things that we oppose, significantly oppose, is the government taking over the role of the family. Boy, have we created a system that mimics that. In effect, those who are taking care of the kids or managing the kids become within the context of juvenile justice, the juvenile justice system, rather than let's figure out a way in which to support what we know is the most effective way of socializing, bringing about positive change in the lives of people, no matter whether they have a serious psychiatric disorder or a substance use disorder, that the engagement of families and communities is a critical element. And what we've created is the exact opposite of that. So let me come.
Criminal charges filed against anybody?
In that particular, who was asking the question? I wasn't looking. In that particular circumstance, no, but there have been others where criminal charges. I mean, because you can
You have been charged.
Right.
Don't treat animals that way.
But do you recognize that the correctional officers thought they were following policy? They weren't. I mean, it's the, you could say, well, should they not be punished themselves for doing this? Well, but it's sort of like, you can look at a lot of other circumstances in our society. This is what they were being told to do. Now, when they've been told to do something else, it's a challenge to get them to change. But in fact, they can modify what they're doing. It is outrageous that this was going on. Their bosses are the ones who really needed to be responsible. But I think, yeah. Pardon?
That's what the Nazi war criminals said they were doing what they were.
I understand. I completely understand. Yeah.
I think it's equally outrageous to present that this is okay in adult corrections. It's not okay there either.
No, I agree. I agree. I couldn't agree with you more. It's not okay anywhere. It doesn't serve a purpose other than to exacerbate whatever the problem is. So if you are angry, if you're dysregulated, if you have a psychotic disorder, you go down the line. This form of being with another human being makes things worse. Yeah.
I worked 17 years in law enforcement and in corrections, but I also worked with abused children down in Florida in the crack neighborhood, and I worked with Children's Home Society, and a lot of the kids that I needed to get into psychotherapy and see psychiatrists, but because the doctors would only take so many free patients, and there were so many children that were setting fires and stuff that were little, like from 5 years old up to like 9 years old, that weren't getting help.
Yeah.
So many doctors would take so many people.
Well, and that's certainly so around the country, that in order to get, I mean, you all know this, in order to get access to care, something really bad has to happen. So, you know, the ticket into care is some acute episode going on rather than, gee, we think we might have a problem, can we get some help now? So that is one thing. The other thing is that one of the reasons I showed you those numbers, we have a misapplication of our resources. So all of those dollars are going into something which is really not very effective. If in fact it was helping to reduce crime, maybe that would be a good use. But if we looked at some early intervention, if we looked at support for families who were struggling with their youth and took some of that resource, if we had easier access to mental health services, it could in fact change those outcomes. Yeah.
I used to work in Washington, and they had some very good laws concerning cultural competency. They had a minority mental health specialist, right. And they also had cultural consultants. Yep. Do those things apply to prisons or juvenile justice systems?
Typically, I mean, I think that the emphasis on cultural competence, which we all know, the way in which you can engage a family is to recognize where they come from, who they are, have some sensitivity to their culture, be it different cultures, different ethnicities, just families in general, learning about that. There's very little of that goes on in correctional settings. There's, again, some of the litigation that we've been a part of and some of the policies that we are driving are targeting those kinds of issues. But it's not like it's pervasive. We happen to be in Washington State, and I'll show you, and not to brag, but we have really emphasized and really focused in on some of those issues. Anyone else? I'm gonna, yeah, in the back.
Where those kids were, what we used to call the hall. Mm-hmm. And you're not such a good mistake. It's demographic. Wow, and these are the kids that didn't get tried as adults because they were already part of it.
Yeah, well, that's of course a whole other problem that we have in our country, and the blindly going into deciding, knowing what we know about the development of the brain, that we've decided that 13 and 14-year-olds should be, again, not to say that they haven't done a bad thing and there needs to be some response, but to try them as adults and sort of essentially say that rehabilitation is not possible is again, it's such a shame on our country. And if we just looked at it from a financial perspective, just forget about the human misery and the human expense. It's wasting money.
When they get out of there, they're going to have a very different attitude toward authority.
Well, as we know that somewhere more particularly with the more violent crimes, you're up to 70% of having done a new crime within 6 months after incarceration. So let me go on, because I want to talk about some other things. And when you talk to juvenile justice administrators around the country, you ask them, what's your biggest problem? These are the people, and again, I don't know the Montana system, and maybe it's something I should get to know in my other capacity with the Department of Justice, but that's a whole other story. But what juvenile justice administrators say is their biggest issue, so it's not like they're blind to this, is mental health, mental health, mental health. They don't know what to do with it. They don't know how to manage it. They don't have the resources to deal with it. And of course, in the mental health profession, there's a lot of, just like there used to be in working with people who are in state hospitals, mental health professionals tend to be biased around working in juvenile justice detention facilities, generally speaking. This to me is my favorite slide when I go and talk to legislators. What it has to do with is, what are the costs of various kinds of programs to the taxpayer? So up on the top, there are various types of drug courts and intensive supervision. In the middle are juvenile offender programs, intensive probation, functional family therapy, multisystemic therapy. I think you've done a little multisystemic therapy here in Montana. You may not be doing it. It's kind of the kids' version of PACT, for those of you who don't know it. That's essentially the evolution of multisystemic therapy. Its parent are PACT programs. So, and then down on the bottom are prevention programs. So look at what happens in terms of taxpayer costs. So you get, and these are large-scale studies who've done what's called a meta-analysis of all these studies. So let me just show you all of them. So for the taxpayer, so savings in court costs, detention costs, all these different costs that are associated with bad outcomes, that if you look at a youth who's enrolled in functional family therapy, in treatment foster care, multisystemic therapy, you get to save taxpayers up to $80,000 per kid. Again, consider the costs here, that if in fact the effectiveness of these programs, just in terms of saving costs over the course of time. So as compared to some of our other things that we sometimes pray at the altar of, scared straight programs and stuff like that, that actually cost the taxpayers money. So just again, keep in mind the effect size of effective intervention can really have a profound effect on dollars spent. If we don't care that much about dollars spent, we have an enormous amount of money. This is a hard one to read. I do, and if Gary, we want to make copies, I do have copies of the PowerPoint with references. But in terms of improving outcomes, so this has to do with reducing criminal recidivism. So bear with me and just take my word for it that in terms of increasing sort of bad programs that sort of have no impact on recidivism or make it worse are ones in which we tend to spend a lot of, there's a lot of glamour to. But you look at some of these family-focused, family skills-based interventions for these populations of youth, and we've got incredibly positive impacts as it relates to recidivism. So engaging families, engaging youth, developing skill sets, having comprehensive services, be they psychiatric, educational, skill enhancement, in fact reduces recidivism. Data's in, saves money, reduces crime. So, and then there's all these various documents that have been produced. The Surgeon General asked that empirically supported treatments be used in public sector settings. The New Freedoms Commission supports this. The Office of Juvenile Justice Delinquency Prevention has a bunch of blueprints. All these things work, and we have really started to develop a scheme here that rather than just staying in university settings, many of these kinds of programs have moved out into what would be demonstrating effectiveness. So there is a vast body of knowledge that demonstrates effectiveness for these types of interventions. Change is a very difficult, you know, how do we change? How do we change things? I'm looking at the time, Gary, and I'm going to go over. How far? I'll just keep going until, you know, I see your eyes glaze over and you tell me to stop. But I'll be another 10 minutes. Is that all right? Clinicians, in order to change, I mean, this is for juvenile justice and mental health. So we put a high value in our mental health systems on creativity and intuition. We got to balance a little of that with science and empirical kinds of things. And many clinicians often feel like they're being demeaned if they're asked to implement a manualized systematic program. We need to be more engaging around that, as the next bullet talks about. That many people in the mental health, and again, mental health provision, be it in juvenile justice and outside of it, are not used to being accountable. Accountability is really a critical element in terms of good outcomes. There are many factors that contribute. I think that there are many implementation strategies and factors that have an impact. And again, I don't have time to go into them, but I think that we have the capacity to bring about change and improve outcomes, save money. I started to talk about CRIPA before, and that's a function of this litigation. And I just want to give you a sense of what's gone on in the country around that. There have been lots and lots of investigations of juvenile correctional facilities. I feel like I'm being unfair to this side. There have been a lot of these investigations. So how does an investigation start? Well, someone says something, my kid is being deprived of his or her rights. You keep writing letters to the Department of Justice, and ultimately they decide whether there is what is systematic, appears to be a need for an investigation. And as I think I said before, there are three places where the Department of Justice focuses on in terms of the rights. It's the Constitution, ADA, and the Individuals with Disabilities Act. That these are federal laws. And the areas of concern that we look at when we go into a facility have to do with, is that child, is that youth being protected, either from other youth or from the staff? Is there a suicide prevention program that is systematic, that is monitored? Are there adequate mental health substance abuse services? Do these youth get medical care commensurate with community standards? And are these kids getting access to education commensurate with IDEA? What we found is in most of the investigation that there's a prevalence of an adult correction model. There's often staff poorly trained, so they fall back on ways in which they would manage people in the community, so they use violence. There's staff violence, there's youth violence. They're unsafe, as you saw, restraint practices. There's youth-on-youth violence, and isolation is the strategy that's often used as a consequence. Now think about isolation. You have a suicidal kid, you have a kid who is psychotic, delusional, and you put him in a room, like one of those cell rooms. No one to talk to. I mean, I don't know how many of you have ever been in a secure, isolated setting and what that experience is like. It's so counterintuitive, counter-therapeutic. So, but these are typically the strategies that are used in these places, and this is what we've been attempting to change. Crowding, older kids with younger kids, juveniles who've done little things with juveniles who've done big bad things. And inappropriate staff-youth relationships, and just in any number of things that happen. So what we've looked at are suicide prevention, coming up with more effective practices, improving mental health, medical, all of these things. I'm not going to do that with you. It's too sad, but the outcome's good. I'm going to get to the end. In Washington State, we did a number of things. A group of us, advocates and academics, have really spent a lot of time. As I told you before, we're very fortunate to be the only university. So we do a lot of interacting with our only healthcare university. So we've been providing a lot of data to our legislature. And we've been able to develop a number of programs. The one I'm talking about here is that for the vast number of youth who go into a juvenile justice setting and spend 6 months, a year, there's no transition program. So if you have no transition program, you've been there for 8 or 10 months, there is no continuity, no disposition planning. So what we proposed, because we had done research showing that engaging parents using programs like PACT for kids, engaging parents early on in the rehabilitation of their kids, and also changing what goes on for kids in these juvenile justice settings, being very skill-oriented. Someone was talking about DBT earlier on, dialectic behavior therapy. What we've done is decided that many of the children, no matter what the diagnosis they have problems of self-regulation. Doesn't mean that they have borderline personality disorder. Many kids with many, many disorders need to learn a way in which to regulate their emotions. Sometimes you help with medicine, but learning it from a cognitive approach is really effective. So we change what goes on for these kids in our juvenile institutions. We, in fact, have a consistent skills-based approach that all the kids learn and all the staff do. Reduce youth-on-youth violence dramatically. Reduced staff complaints, staff love it, because they have a way in which they're teaching kids a different way of interacting with each other. And again, I don't have time to kind of take you through it. The other thing we did is, let's not continue the practice of disassociating kids from their families. Let's engage them actively. Let's not make this a replication of a bogus adult model. Let's make these places receptive to families, and let's think that the way in which you bring about change is not by keeping a kid for 8 or 10 months and doing a little bit with them, but is helping to support families in terms of getting increased skill sets. So we got a fairly large allocation of resources, because what we said we could do is we can improve the outcomes. Not too hard, from my perspective, to improve 70% recidivism rate. I mean, it's almost like it could be accidental. And every percentage that you improve recidivism translates into large dollars in terms of savings to the public. So we developed this program, which we engage families 3 months before their kids left the facility. We taught them a whole host of, we worked with them around skills. We facilitated their visiting of their youth, because probably in Montana too, often the facilities are far away from where the kids live. We came up with a strategy that really was targeted on engagement. Being that I'm way out of time, the end of the short and long of this is that we reduced and we also targeted the kids who had a psychiatric disorder in addition to conduct disorder, because it's kind of the coin of the realm to get conduct disorder, and had a substance use disorder. So we really wanted to target the kids with a serious mental illness and substance abuse. So very difficult population, and we've been able to demonstrate a close to a 30% reduction in recidivism with this population, and close to 90% of engagement with families. Again, often people say, well, these these families won't work with us. So again, this, depending upon who's, how much you emphasize engagement, we certainly have been able to demonstrate that. So it is possible to bring about change. South Dakota, that facility is closed, no longer exists. There's much more of an engagement. In Louisiana, one of the most egregious, corrupt, mean systems that I've ever seen, where children were, it was like going to a concentration camp where these kids were being held, are now the recipients, partly on the basis of the litigation, now the recipients of MacArthur grants and Annie Casey grants, and have really, again, they still struggle, but have really reduced their population by close to 80% in their secure facilities. So changes, even in difficult places, is very possible. But you have to have the advocacy, the tenacity, and the passion, as well as the data to be able to convince people. Yeah. Speak up, son.
Do you have any recommendations for like books or therapy models?
Say it again. Someone else say it for you.
I'll say it. She's got some laryngitis or something going on. She wants to know if you have any recommendations for books or therapeutic models that we could look at.
Yeah. I give you a list, but what I'm going to do is provide a list of references and websites and a bunch of things that you guys can look at and sort of see and be able to use. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff in this area. Thank you very much.
Aspects of my story that are really typical, and then there are aspects of my story that are atypical.
Come out and represent such a positive, healthy role model of recovery.
We have what we call the Alliance in Billings, which is the 3 major healthcare providers.
The day when he's really alert and can focus on his work. And then somebody this morning talked
into getting the world a better place. And it's both true, because the professionals actually need the resources, the payments.
Some of the policies that we are driving are targeting those kinds of issues, but it's not like it's
analogy as opposed to an electrical line analogy, the circuitry and learning.